I. Danny Gumbo examined what the caboose wheels had left of the large young body on the embalming table without any expression at all on his face, but deep within him was a churning bitterness. Sal Stone, all right, he said in a colorless voice. Then, as though conscious something aside from dazed apathy was expected of him, he added with forced briskness. Funny, the way it missed his head completely. We figure he fell square across one track with his head clear of the rails, Chief Ward Herbert said. The wheels caught him at belt level. Danny lifted achromatic eyes to the face of the fat chief. Then how you account for his arms? A guy falling would push his arms in front of him, not hold them flat to his sides. We figure he fell clear from the top of the car, the police chief said. Probably he rolled before the wheels hit him. Gumbo's lips tightened. Or maybe he was dead before he fell. Abruptly he turned and stalked toward the exit from the funeral parlor's basement, a thin, tall man in his early 30s who moved with a belligerent strut, as though daring anyone to block his way. Outside he waited for the slower-moving fat man to catch up. How could he be dead before he fell? Chief Herbert asked querulously. He just had an unlucky accident. 3 witnesses saw him hold up the restaurant, clean out the cash drawer and shoot Larson, the proprietor. Then he hopped a freight to get out of town. There can't be any mistake about him being the robber, because we found the money and the murder gun on his body. Why'd he wait 5 hours to hop a freight? The chief shook his head resignedly. What's eating you, Gumbo? So the guy was a respected citizen in Buffalo, but down here turns out to be a killer. That any skin off your nose? You act like the guy was your brother. You fat slob. Danny thought. But what he said was milder than his thoughts. My chief in Buffalo told me to stick around long as I thought necessary. Mind? Don't trust small-town police work, huh? Herbert asked resentfully. You think maybe because our 5 cops ain't split up into fancy name teams like Vice Squad and Homicide Department, we never catch the right guy, is that it? The little man's patient expression hid growing irritation. I don't think anything. Got any objection to my sticking around? Can't very well run you out of town. But just remember, Buffalo private detectives got no jurisdiction in Missouri. What's the name of that fancy place you work for up there? Homicide and arson. Yeah. Imagine that. A whole department to chase murderers and firebugs. Possibly we have more murders and fires than St. Michael, Danny said shortly. Do I get police backing if I poke around? What's there to poke for? Kind of like to know why a straight character like Sal suddenly went nuts. Occur to you maybe this was a frame? The fat man said. Who'd bother to frame a hobo? Somebody mad at the guy he was supposed to have killed. Who held a grudge against Jonathan Larson? The chief opened his mouth, closed it again and let the fat around his eyes squeeze them half shut. That kind of question could get you in trouble if you asked it too public. There ain't no doubt about Stone being the killer, and very little doubt about robbery being the sole motive. But in a town this size, gossip builds mountains out of molehills. You ask that question to a few people and it plants suspicion. They kick it around without a shade of evidence to go on, and first thing you know everybody's asking, think so-and-so hired Jonathan killed, and the robbery was just a cover-up motive? Couldn't really blame so-and-so for getting mad, could you? Danny stared at the fat man in amazement. Was this a warning, or an oblique suggestion as to how to start things moving? The former implied the chief's complicity in some sort of underworld arrangement, and the latter that he was as suspicious as Danny, but for some, who found it unhealthy to be a stranger asking questions, reasoned fearful of continuing the investigation himself. Either interpretation required Danny to adjust his opinion of the man's intelligence, but before he could decide which way to take the chief's remarkable statement, a tall man in a light gabardine suit stopped and said, "Good afternoon, Chief." The man was meagerly built, with a thin, alert face and a jutting jawline. His complexion was a smooth tan, but his iron gray hair indicated he was past 50. Chief Herbert said. "Afternoon, Your Honor. Meet Mr. Gumbo out of Buffalo." To Danny he said. "His Honor, Mayor Angus." Aside from being mayor, Mr. Angus also owns the Bijou, only legitimate theater in the county. As they shook hands, the mayor's alert eyes examined Danny attentively. "Long way from home, aren't you?" "About 900 miles. The private detective isn't satisfied with our solution of the Larson case," the chief said. "Wants to stay around and ask questions." The mayor shot a quick glance at the fat man. "Does our force require outside help?" Chief Herbert shrugged. "I've closed the case as solved, and got no intention of reopening it. Don't see how I can prevent Gumbo from asking questions though, long as he behaves himself." Danny sensed a baffling undercurrent in this exchange without being able to analyze it. Was the chief subtly telling the mayor to mind his own business, or carefully explaining his position so that he could not be held responsible for whatever Danny dug up? The double-meaning innuendos began to irritate the little man. "What questions do you intend to ask?" the mayor said to him. "Things like who had enough grudge against Jonathan Larson to hire him killed?" An opaque film seemed to settle over Mayor Angus's eyes. "I was under the impression the killing was the bandit's own idea." Danny shrugged. "Maybe it was. But from the way Chief Herbert describes the robbery, the bandit could have gotten away without hurting anyone, but deliberately went to the unnecessary trouble of killing Larson. Sounds to me as though his purpose was murder as much as robbery." "I see," the mayor said thoughtfully. After a short pause he added in a deliberate tone. "You'll probably discover he was trying to have me impeached. But being mayor of St. Michael is an hour-a-day job with $500 a year salary, in case you wonder if desire to hang on to the job is sufficient motive to hire a man killed. You may unearth some other people with better motives, but I wouldn't advise stirring up gossip unless you first uncover evidence that the killer actually was a hired assassin." Another warning? As he walked back to the hotel, Danny wondered if anyone in St. Michael spoke straight out what he meant, or if he could expect to encounter from everyone the sale double-talk which suggested menace and friendly advice at the sale time. In the hotel bar he brooded over a bourbon and soda while contemplating what little evidence he had. Information of Sal's death had come to the Buffalo police in the form of a telegram from Chief Herbert reporting the death of a bandit named Sal Stone, whose papers showed he was a resident of Buffalo, and asking if he was wanted for anything there. Since Sal Stone was a pseudonym under which the dead man had both written and traveled, and while he was hardly a nationally famous writer, he was well known and well thought of in Buffalo, the Buffalo police were amazed to discover he was a bandit. Danny was not amazed, he simply did not believe it. And since he had a personal interest in the matter, he immediately obtained leave of absence and hopped a plane for St. Michael. On arrival he learned Sal was accused of robbery and murder, and with Sal's death the police had marked the case closed. In the face of the evidence Danny could hardly blame them, except for the chief's refusal to even consider the lack of motive. Aside from the fact that big, grinning Sal would have been incapable of shooting a man in cold blood, there simply had been no reason for him to commit armed robbery. Stone wasn't a real hobo, he had tried to explain to Chief Herbert. He was a professional writer bumming around for magazine article material. He wasn't rich, but he could write a check up to $2,000. Why would he knock over a restaurant for $200? But against the testimony of 3 witnesses, the chief had no intention of reopening the case on the say-so of an out-of-state pie. Until the fat man's odd dissertation on the evils of gossip, Danny had grown increasingly to regard him as a pig-headed fool, but gradually he was beginning to realize the man's placid exterior concealed a tortuous subtlety. Whether this would prove helpful or dangerous to the little detective sergeant was still an open question. 2. When he finished his drink, Danny left the hotel again and walked 2 blocks to the town square. From the Western Union office he sent a wire to Buffalo stating arrangements had been made to ship the body home the next day. Then he crossed the square to the restaurant Sal was supposed to have robbed. In streamlining, the Missouri Cafe was years ahead of the rest of the town. From its glass brick front to its chrome and bakelite tables, it was strictly modernistic. Apparently its owner's murder had not driven away business, for even though the hour was 8:30 p.m., a half-dozen patrons were seated at tables. Danny perched on one of the red leather stools at the glistening black counter and ordered a cup of coffee. He was served by a bright-eyed brunette of about 20, who seemed to be responsible only for counter trade and the cash register, for in spite of Danny being the only counter customer, she paid no attention to the loud throat clearing of a table patron wanting service. After placing Danny's coffee in front of him, she stood watching him idly, and eventually another girl came from the kitchen to investigate the noise. "You on the night shift?" Danny asked abruptly. 3 to 11, she said, and a wariness jumped into her eyes, the wariness of a girl whom experience has taught to expect. "What are you doing after work?" Immediately following questions about her hours. "What's your name?" "Janet," she said without enthusiasm. "Worked night before last, Janet?" "The night of the stick-up?" The wariness was replaced by interest. "I'll say I did. I was as close to the bandit as I am to you." "You were one of the witnesses, eh?" "Sure. Me and Mona, she's the girl, just went back in the kitchen, and Henry, the cook, all had to go over to Whirlinger's funeral home to identify the bandit's body. They use Whirlinger's for a morgue, you know, on account of we got no regular morgue." Danny asked. "Just the 3 of you and Mr. Larson were here when it happened?" "Yeah," she said eagerly, gratified by his attentiveness. "It was just before closing and there hadn't been a customer for 15 minutes. when in walked this fellow with a handkerchief over his face. Handkerchief, Danny snapped. Chief Herbert didn't say anything about a handkerchief. Some of her previous wariness returned. Say, are you a reporter or something? Cop, said Danny. Detective Sergeant Gumbo. She eyed him suspiciously. Then you must be new. I know all the cops. I'm from Buffalo. He slipped a badge from his vest pocket and held it before her face a moment before returning it. Down to take back the body. I have no official connection with the case. Just interested. Oh, she said, obviously impressed by meeting a big city detective from so far away. About the handkerchief, Danny prodded. How'd you identify the bandit if his face was covered? Why, he might as well left it off, she scoffed. He'd been in here for supper, you see, and I recognized him right away in spite of the mask. He had this white scar through one eyebrow, and his nose had a bump on it, where it had been broken sometime, I guess. The handkerchief didn't hide that. Then too, I could tell the clothes. He had on a green corduroy jacket with leather elbow guards and leather patch pockets, blue denim pants and a pork pie hat with a little hole worn where it pinched together in front. I noticed his clothes at supper because they was old and kind of worn like a hobo's but clean as a pin and even pressed. A slow sickness built within the little man. This was no primed witness. She was telling the truth spontaneously, and her testimony left no doubt that the killer had been Sal. How'd the shooting happen? He asked dully. That was the terriblest thing of all. No call for it whatever. With his gun the bandit motioned me and Mona and Mr. Larson behind the counter, then pushed open the kitchen door, still keeping his gun on us, and made Henry come out too. We all crowded over there near the coffee urn while he cleaned out the register. Then he backed to the door, and we all thought he was just going to leave. Nobody made a move or said a thing, but all of a sudden he aimed the gun at Mr. Larson and fired. The boss fell dead just like that, she snapped her fingers. Then the robber ran out the door. As one of the table customers approached the counter with his check, Janet moved over to the register. Moodily the little man watched the waitress, Mona, bring a tray of food from the kitchen and return again with a load of dirty dishes. He drained his coffee cup and pushed it away. The bandit seemed to have been Sal all right, he decided, but he could not have been in his right mind. The wild possibility that Sal had been hypnotized by some master criminal jumped into his mind, to be irritably kicked out as plausible only in comic books. Could Sal somehow have been roped into what he thought was a practical joke? The idea seemed as far-fetched as the first, except the only possible circumstance under which Danny could visualize the good-natured Sal firing a gun at another human, was if he believed it loaded with blanks. He turned his mind back to Chief Ward Herbert's remarks about starting gossip, wondering again if it had been meant as a warning or a suggestion. It seemed a sound plan to stir things up a little in either event, since he had no idea where else to start. When the waitress returned to him, he said, "You know, Janet, it sounds to me as though the bandit's real purpose was to kill your boss, and robbery was just a cover-up." "How you mean?" Danny examined his fingernails. "Suppose some local Joe wanted Larson out of the way, but was afraid if anything happened to him, everyone in town would know right where to look for the murderer. So he hires an out-of-town hobo to stick up the restaurant and knock off your boss. Everybody takes it for granted it's a simple case of murder during robbery, so no one even thinks about this local Joe's grudge." He glanced up to see the girl staring at him with widespread eyes, her lips formed into a round circle. "Crap," she breathed. "Art Simon or Harry Stewart?" "Who?" "Art Simon, who runs the Blue Goose across the square, or Harry Stewart, who has the bingo hall and a bookshop. The boss headed the Citizens Committee, which was trying to get the mayor impeached so they could run gambling out of town. You see, Mayor Angus won't let the police touch Simon's or Stewart's gambling places, and if the Citizens Committee got the mayor kicked out, they'd get the council to appoint an interim mayor who would clamp down on both of them. Why won't Angus let the police touch Simon or Stewart?" "He thinks gambling draws in tourists or something," Janet said. "Or so he says. Personally I think he figures the stage shows he books for his theater aren't good enough to draw people in from very far, but with gambling pulling folks from all over the county, a lot go to the Bijou, beings they're already in town." Danny let his lips curl in a cynical smile. "I could think of a more probable reason." She eyed him, puzzled. "What's the usual reason local governments give protection to guys running illegal businesses?" he asked. Her face remained blank, then slowly the dawn of understanding lighted her eyes. "Protection money. I'll bet Art Simon and Harry Stewart are paying him off." She frowned thoughtfully. "That would give Mayor Angus just as much motive as either of them though. For that matter Paul Wilson's got as much motive as all three of them." "Who's Paul Wilson?" Druggist on the corner. Mr. Larson was divorcing his wife and naming Paul correspondent. Like to have ruined Paul's business in a small town like this, Danny said. Kind of gives Mrs. Larson a motive too then, doesn't it? Wouldn't she inherit the restaurant? The girl's mouth widened into a delighted grin. Yeah, she said. It's kind of convenient for the old gal, isn't it? Danny rose, paid 7 cents for his coffee and slipped a quarter tip under the saucer. Better not mention our conversation to anyone, unless you're sure it's someone who won't repeat it. Wouldn't do for the guilty person to have warning before Chief Herbert has time to act. Oh, sure, Janet breathed. Danny watched the other waitress enter the kitchen with a tray. I'd like to talk to Mona and the cook now, he said. All right to go back in the kitchen. Sure. Go right ahead. He learned nothing from Mona or the cook, Henry, except they were equally positive in their identification of the body lying at the funeral parlor as that of the bandit. When he came out of the kitchen again, Janet was ringing the register for a woman who was paying her bill. And wouldn't it be awful if the robbery was just a cover-up, he heard her say in a low voice. But don't repeat it to a soul. As he left the restaurant, the little man's grin was self-satisfied. 3. Obviously the Blue Goose was straight out of the pre-Prohibition era, complete to sawdust, brass rail and cuspidors. Through double curtains across an archway at the rear came the whir of slot machines and the brittle click of dice. Aside from 2 men leaning against the bar, most of the place's custom seemed to be the other side of the curtains. Looking for Art Simon, Danny told the bartender. Usual table, the man said, jerking his head toward the archway. The little man parted the curtains and stepped into a wide, barn-like room containing a roulette wheel, 3 dice tables, 2 poker tables and about 20 slot machines. 5 men sat around one of the poker tables, a half-dozen more ringed one of the dice boards and 3 women played slot machines. No one was playing roulette. Behind a square table centered nearly against the rear wall sat a large-boned man of middle age wearing a close-cut mustache and goatee. Laid out in front of him on the table were stacked coins ranging from nickels to silver dollars, the last denomination taking up half the table space in stacks of 10 each. Danny approached the man and said, "Looking for Art Simon." Sharp eyes surveyed Danny before the man spoke, and his gaze was such a solid ray of power, it exerted nearly physical force. The little man got a fleeting impression of ruthlessness, and experienced mild surprise to encounter it in a small-town gambler. A dangerous opponent, was his first appraisal, but he immediately revised it downward when he detected evidence that the man's forcefulness was largely theatrical effect. His whole personality was an obvious pose, from the small beard which only partially concealed a weak chin, to the thick gold ring with its glittering yellow diamond, which he wore on his right forefinger. "You've found him," the man said. "My name is Danny Gumbo. Buffalo homicide and arson. Got permission from Chief Herbert to ask questions." "About what?" "Killing night before last. Kind of like to know what made an honest Buffalonian turn killer." The sharp eyes glanced at Danny again, but when they clashed with the smaller man's steady gaze, immediately dropped. "What makes you think I'd know?" "Didn't say you did," Danny said. "Thought I'd try tracing back the kid's movements after he hit town. Got to start somewhere." "Better start somewhere else." He became absorbed in the refracted light from the stone on his index finger. "Never heard of the guy until he was dead." Simon turned his attention to a portly, bald-headed man who wanted to trade a $20 bill for silver dollars. "Aren't many places in town a fellow could go," Danny said mildly. "Thought maybe he dropped in here. Big fellow about your build, wearing a green corduroy jacket with leather pockets and elbow patches, denim pants and a flat fedora." The portly man glanced at Danny. "You talking about that tramp who murdered Jonathan Larson?" Danny eyed the man deliberately. "The kid accused of it, yes. He was around here a couple of days. Getting the lay of the land, I guess. Tuesday night he made $30 riding me on a hot roll, then backed out of the game. The next afternoon I saw him drop 5 and quit. You'd think a guy that cagey with money wouldn't need to stick anyone up, but that sale night he robbed the Missouri Cafe." He shifted his attention to the bearded man. "You remember the guy he is talking of, Art? You gave him a letter to mail for you." Simon's face assumed an expression of sudden enlightenment. "Yeah, I remember the guy now. Big fellow in his late 20s with a bent nose and a scar through one eyebrow. Looked like a hobo. Didn't realize he was the one killed Larson." "You gave him a letter to mail?" Danny asked. The gambler nodded and flicked a thumb in the direction of one of the tables. "Yeah. Wanted it to make the 5 o'clock mail train. He was standing there doing nothing, so I gave him $1 to run it over to the post office." "Was he alone or with somebody?" "Alone, I think, Simon said. Didn't really notice. Danny turned to the bald-headed man. You notice? I think he was by himself. No, wait a minute. By himself Tuesday, and I think he came in alone Wednesday afternoon, but I saw him leave with Paul Wilson. The druggist, Danny said softly. Thanks, mister. Nodding curtly to the bearded man, he left the Blue Goose and crossed the square again to a store with a sign on the window reading, Wilson's Drugs and Sundries. The man who came from the prescription room to wait on Danny was as tall and heavy-set as Art Simon. But there the resemblance ended. He had a soft, round face and large dark eyes like a woman's, but a blunt jaw and square, hard mouth saved him from effeminacy. Instead of asking what Danny wanted, he questioned him silently with a direct, impersonal gaze. You Paul Wilson? The little man asked. Yes. My name is Danny Gumbo. With the Buffalo Police. Got Chief Herbert's okay to ask questions about the killing Wednesday night? Yes? Understand you knew the guy who stuck up the Missouri Cafe. The dark eyes stared straight into Danny's face. Afraid you've been misinformed. Danny shook his head. You left the Blue Goose with him a few hours before the robbery. Wilson's expression did not change. Oh, that. We did leave at the sale time, but we weren't together. Witnesses say you were. Danny estimated the man, then hazarded. For quite a while. That's not true, Wilson said calmly. We talked not more than a minute in front of the Blue Goose. Then I came back to the store and he went on to the bookshop. What you talk about? Nothing, really. I just met the man 5 minutes before. He asked where Stewart's bookshop was and I told him. Ask where the post office was too? The druggist shook his head. Have a letter in his hand? Danny asked. A letter? Don't remember any. Yes, now that you mention it, I believe he did. But he didn't go to the post office when he left you? Wilson's voice developed an edge of impatience. He may have. I didn't watch where he went. He asked about the bookshop, so I assumed he intended to go there. Where is this bookshop? Over the bingo hall next to the fire station. Block and a half east. Where's the post office? 1 block west. Thanks, Danny said, and left the store. Outside 2 women standing by the show window furtively glanced at him, then peered through the window into the store. That must be the Buffalo detective, one said to the other in a whisper she mistakenly believed would not carry. Do you think Mr. Wilson? The little man was gratified to learn how quickly his seed was taking root. At the post office he found a plump, gray-haired woman sorting mail behind the counter. You the postmistress? He asked. That's me, she admitted. Were you here Wednesday afternoon? All day Wednesday, Danny said. Notice a man come in to mail a letter who wore a green corduroy jacket trimmed with leather, denim pants and a pork pie hat with a hole in it? Why? She asked. I'm from the Buffalo Police. He produced his badge. I have the local chief's permission to ask questions. She examined him interestedly. Chasing a crook? Sort of, Danny said noncommittally. Remember the man I described? She shook her head. Nope. What did he look like? He was about 28 years old, had a nose with a crooked bump on it and a scar through one eyebrow. Kind of good-natured, but beat-up face. She shook her head again. Sorry. Don't think he was in. Think I'd remember it too, because I really wasn't very busy at all on Wednesday. Were you here alone? Yep. My mail clerk's been sick for a week. Any place in town aside from here a guy could mail a letter? Danny asked. Just the mailbox in front of the place. Most people come on in when the post office is open. Thanks, the little man said. 4. Careen paint blanked out all of the wide show window next to the fire hall, except for an oblong section through which a poster proclaimed, Monday, Thursday, Saturday, 30 regular, 10 special games, $5 to $100 prizes. Over a doorway beside the bingo hall hung a sign reading, Smoke Shop Upstairs. But at the top of the stairs there was no evidence of any tobacco business. Instead of the usual token front room engaged in selling cigarettes and cigars, the stairhead led directly into the bookshop. A race was in progress as Danny entered, for a man wearing a phone headset stood in front of a large blackboard droning the positions of the horses at each quarter. Seated on a dozen of the approximately 50 chairs facing the blackboard, a mixed audience of men and women listened to the results. Ringing the walls were a series of long, narrow tables littered with racing forms and turf news, and several men sat at these, concentrating on dope sheets and paying no attention to the race currently being run. Behind a cashier's cage to the right of the blackboard sat a young red-headed man wearing horn-rimmed glasses. Approaching the cashier, Danny said, "I'm with the Buffalo Police. Got Chief Herbert's okay to look into the Larson killing. Trying to check back on the bandits' movements the day of the robbery, and understand he was in here." The customer greeting smile on the redhead's pale face faded to blankness. Behind their glasses his colorless eyes examined Danny deliberately. "He wasn't here," he said in a flat voice. 19. "You Harry Stewart?" the little man asked mildly. "No. Like to talk to Mr. Stewart," the redhead said in a toneless voice. "Sorry. He's busy." Casually Danny put one hand on the swinging gate next to the cashier's cage. "That his office over there?" he asked. In one quick movement the cashier swept off his glasses, laid them in front of him and stepped in front of the gate. From an advantage of 3 inches he stared down at the little man with his jaw outthrust. Danny's eyes brightened with an interested, almost eager look, and gently he massaged his left fist with his right palm. Then he dropped the fist to his side and slowly began to push open the gate. The cashier drew in his chin. "Wait here," he said, turned abruptly and ducked into the office door Danny had indicated. Almost immediately he was back, followed by a thick-set, heavy-shouldered man with a long, jaundiced face and a crew haircut. The redhead slid back on his stool and replaced his glasses, and the yellow-faced man pushed open the swinging gate to come out into the main room. At that moment the race ended. There was a sudden burst of conversation from the audience and people began to crowd up to the cashier's cage, either to collect their winnings or lay bets on the next race. The yellow-faced man stood quietly examining Danny until the hubbub subsided sufficiently for his voice to be heard. "What's on your mind?" he asked. Danny said, "You Harry Stewart?" The man nodded. "You run this place?" Stewart nodded again. Danny repeated what he had told the cashier. "You got a bum steer," Stewart said. "He wasn't in here. Witnesses say he was." "The witnesses are wrong." "Fellow wore a green corduroy jacket with leather trimming," Danny said mildly. "Denim pants and pork pie hat. He wasn't here. Maybe you just didn't see him." Danny turned to the cashier. "Recognize that description?" The cashier stared at Danny stonily and Harry Stewart said, "Jack didn't see him either. Take a walk, Stewart." Danny's eyes flicked over the other's chin at Stewarty, but his tone remained amiable. "Remember the guy?" he asked Jack. The yellow of the big man's complexion deepened to orange, and he reached spread fingers for Danny's shirt front. But before they could bunch the material together into a ball, the little man's left whipped around like a swinging bat, and the crack of a line drive sounded and the big man sat on the floor. When his eyes uncrossed, he focused them blearily on the little detective. "Remember the guy now?" Danny quietly asked the cashier. The man moved his pale face back and forth sidewise. "No sir. He wasn't here." Harry Stewart's dazed expression turned to malevolence, but he made no attempt to regain his feet. Amid the silent scrutiny of the horse players, Danny stalked to the stairhead and went on down the steps. 5 minutes later when he entered the hotel lobby and passed the desk, he was stopped by the day clerk. "Mr. Gumbo," the clerk said. "Is it true the police think the Missouri Cafe robbery was a put-up job by some local person?" "I wouldn't know," Danny said. "You'd have to ask Chief Herbert." After dinner the little man sat in his room and waited for the moving tide of gossip to flow over the town. He had no idea what effect his plan would have, merely having proceeded on the principle that stirring a muddy pond could not make it muddier, and might bring something to the surface. At 8 o'clock the first tangible effects appeared in the persons of the mayor and the chief of police. Politely offering his honor the lone easy chair, and the fat chief the only other chair, an uncomfortable straight back, Danny seated himself on the bed. "You've been misrepresenting the truth, Gumbo," Chief Herbert said reproachfully. "You've been creating the impression you got my backing and you're poking around." Danny raised innocent eyebrows. "I merely said I had your permission to ask questions. But people got the idea I put you up to it. Thought I made it clear you was on your own." "That's unimportant now," Angus broke in. "Sergeant Gumbo, your rather loose talk around town has started a lot of gossip I resent exceedingly." Danny turned his head to survey the mayor and was surprised to note the man's thin face was pale and pinched, not with anger, but with fright. "What kind of gossip?" he asked. "You know very well what kind of gossip, since you started it," Angus said irritably. "The whole town is suddenly convinced that Man Stone was hired to kill Larson by someone local. Opinion on who did the hiring seems divided between the team of Wilson and Mrs. Larson and the team of Art Simon, Harry Stewart and myself." "Tough," Danny said unfeelingly. "Wouldn't be surprised if one of those views is correct." The mayor raised a hand that shook slightly. I wouldn't so much resent speculation that I hired the killer myself, since it's public knowledge Larson wanted me impeached. But linking me with Simon and Stewart is hitting below the belt. People are saying they pay me protection money to let them operate unmolested, the implication being we constitute some kind of criminal organization. But I assure you my $500 a year salary is every cent I receive from the mayor's office, directly or indirectly, Danny said. That story must have been kicking around before Larson was killed, else why the petition to impeach you? The mayor said indignantly. There was no question of dishonesty behind that. Even the Citizens Committee never accused me of anything but dereliction of duty. The whole argument on gambling is simply a difference of opinion about what is best for the town. My own opinion is that it stimulates trade and benefits the merchants. The gambling enterprises draw people from all over the county, and aside from my theater, there certainly is nothing else in St. Michael to attract visitors. Many businessmen agree with me, and the Citizens Committee simply represents the blue-nosed faction which doesn't. All this Danny absorbed in silence. Finally he said. If I understand you straight, you don't mind being accused of hiring a guy murdered, but you resent being accused of accepting bribes. You're twisting my meaning, Angus objected. I meant I could understand why people think I had a motive to kill Larson, mistaken as their opinion is, but linking me with Simon and Stewart is the most vicious kind of speculation without the slightest foundation, Danny said. This is all very interesting, but just what do you expect me to do about it? Mayor Angus cleared his throat and 21 glanced over at his fat companion, who pointedly missed the invitation to take the floor by blowing his nose. The chief and I think you should drop this investigation and return to Buffalo, the mayor said finally. Danny glanced at Chief Ward Herbert. What do you think, Chief? I'm here at Mayor Angus's request, the fat man said carefully. I've explained to him my official interest in the case is closed, and I was willing to repeat to you that your investigation doesn't have my sanction. Suppose I continue anyway? The chief shrugged. No law I know of to prevent a man asking questions. You're virtually telling him he can stay in town. The mayor said sharply. Chief Herbert regarded the mayor from half-closed eyes. You sign a charge of some kind, sir, and I'll put him on the next train. Angus's pale face reddened and abruptly he got to his feet. I seem to have wasted my time talking to either of you, he said, and stalked from the room. The fat chief's left eyelid drooped in what might have been a wink, then he surged to his feet with a grunt and started to follow the mayor. Just a minute, Chief, Danny called. In the doorway the fat man turned to look back. About this Art Simon and this Harry Stewart. How they get along? So, I guess. Just how you mean? Occurred to me this is a kind of small town to support two gamblers. They got a partnership or something? The fat man grinned a peculiar grin. You're wasting your time looking for an underworld setup of some kind in this town. You've been in a city too long. Simon and Stewart are just businessmen. Friendly competitors, like two grocery stores would be. Far as I know they're not in partnership, but they ain't gunning for each other either. Thanks for dropping in, Danny said. The chief lingered for a minute. You shouldn't have swung on Harry, Gumbo. He's not a mug who has to take rushing around from cops. Around here he's considered a prominent citizen. Member of the town council, in fact. One of Danny's eyebrows raised. That's so? How about Art Simon? Member of the council too. The peculiar grin formed again. So's Paul Wilson. 3 of your suspects are part of the local governing body. Ain't that interesting? Almost a majority, because there's only 7 of the council. When the chief left the little man mulled over the visit without getting anywhere. About Mayor Angus he was even more puzzled than before, but at least Chief Ward Herbert's position seemed a little clearer. Apparently the fat man wanted Danny to continue his investigation, but wanted no personal connection with it. That could mean either that he was afraid of someone, or was merely taking the politic attitude that a small-town police chief could not afford to step on the toes of influential local citizens unless he had more than suspicion to go on. In either event, if the chief was not exactly on Danny's side, apparently he was not against him. An hour passed before Danny's next visitor arrived. At an imperious rap he opened the door to a striking brunette about his own age. She was taller than Danny, with ebon hair and luminous eyes and a square-jawed, olive face. Her nose curved slightly over a sulky mouth which gave her an appearance of restlessness. I'm Mrs. Larson, she announced. Come in, Danny said, stepping back and waving her toward the easy chair. She entered, closed the door and stood with her back to it, ignoring the proffered chair. If you're not out of town by morning, she said. I'm going to sue you for slander. All right, Danny said agreeably. The anger in her eyes was partially displaced by surprise. You mean you'll leave? I mean go ahead and sue. Color rushed to her face and her eyes blazed. But before she could speak again, another knock sounded. Immediately she stepped away from the door and examined it fearfully, as though trying to guess who stood on the other side. Come in, invited Danny. The door pushed open to disclose Paul Wilson. He started to open his mouth, saw Mrs. Larson, shut it again and closed the door. What are you doing here, Grace? He asked. Probably the sale thing you are, she snapped. Wilson swung his eyes back to Danny. Perhaps it's just as well we're here together. Gumbo, unless you make immediate public apology for the rumors you've started, I intend to sue you for defamation of character. What rumors? You know very well what. The dirty story you've spread that Grace, Mrs. Larson and I hired her husband murdered. Never even suggested such a thing, Danny said. Simply suggested somebody might have. But that coupled with Larson's idiotic divorce action. Listen, bub, Danny interrupted. What Larson did to you is none of my concern, nor what you did to him to make him do it. That restaurant robbery was as phony as a telephone booth, and that I'll quote for the papers. If people are embroidering that with dirt, I'm sorry, but you can expect dirt in a murder investigation. Somebody had Larson killed, and when we catch the guilty guy, people will stop talking about you, unless you're the guy that did it. But if you think I'm going to stop a murder investigation because your feelings are hurt, think again. You, Grace Larson started to say, but stopped when the phone rang. Danny lifted the receiver and said, Yeah? This is Mayor Angus, a tense voice said in his ear. I've been trying to reach the chief, but can't. I've discovered something in the men's dressing room at the Bijou. What? Something missing. We haven't had a show this week, or I'd have discovered it sooner. Can you come over here? Listen, Mr. Mayor, Danny said irritably. All I'm in town for is the Larson killing. Call on the local police to solve your robbery. But this may tie in with the Larson case. If it means what I think it does, it puts an entirely different complexion on the whole matter. I just discovered. Hold it. Danny interrupted. He glanced at the attentive faces of Wilson and Mrs. Larson. Where is the Bijou? First block beyond the square on Main Street. The front door is open, so just come on backstage. Be right there, Danny said, and hung up. Grace Larson said. That sounded like Mayor Angus's voice. Did I understand him to say something about my husband? You got good ears, lady, Danny said. Sorry to rush you people off, but I got an appointment. He shooed them from the room amid assurances from Wilson that he had not heard the last of this. From his window he could see by the dim light of a street lamp that they got in the sale car and drove off toward the square. It took Danny only 10 minutes to walk to the Bijou. As Angus had indicated, he found the front door unlocked and walked in. A single small light burned in the lobby, and in the main auditorium only the footlights were on. Danny made his way down a dark aisle to the stage, mounted steps at one side and walked backstage. He found himself in a lighted hallway, past 2 doors marked with stars, another labeled ladies' dressing room, and eventually came to one marked men's dressing room. The door was slightly ajar and light shone from within. Danny pushed the door the rest of the way open, stepped through and then stopped still. Mayor Angus lay face up on the floor in the center of a pool of blood. Simultaneously with his realization that the man was dead, Danny sensed another presence in the room and attempted to spin around in order to slam the door back against whatever was behind it. The spin was but half completed when a star shell went off in his brain, the momentary flash being followed by pitch blackness. The first thing of which Danny's dim consciousness grew aware was a large shoe. He closed his eyes until the noise in his head subsided to boiler factory intensity, then opened them and let his gaze travel from the shoe up a wrinkled pant leg, across a bulging stomach to the face of Chief Herbert. The chief stood some 4 feet away idly swinging a large revolver. Danny sat up and rubbed the back of his head. Finally he stood up, swaying slightly, and looked around the room. Except for the body of Angus, he and the chief were alone. On the floor next to where Danny had been a moment before lay an automatic, and lying next to the dead man was a heavy cane. Neither had been present when Danny first entered the room. You clip me? Danny asked dully. The chief shook his head. Just got here. Mayor Angus left word at the jail for me to drop around. He phoned me he had a lead on the murder, Danny said dispiritedly. Said something had been stolen from this room. When I walked in, he was lying like that and his murderer clunked me from behind. I didn't see who it was. Sure, the fat chief said tolerantly. You was framed. Danny peered at the fat man through aching eyes. Think I shot him and then knocked myself out? Herbert gestured with his gun toward the cane. Looks like you shot him, then he biffed you with the cane before he died. Come awake, Danny said sourly. Do I look stupid enough to let a guy with a cane bean me if I had a gun in my hand? No stupider than getting clipped from behind. All right, Danny said. Either way I'm stupid. But you'll probably find that cane came from the stock room and hasn't got Angus's fingerprints on it. And if that's supposed to be the murder gun, it's not mine. I haven't been carrying one because I got no permit for Missouri, but you'll find it in my suitcase at the hotel. You can check which one is mine with Buffalo. Guys have been known to own 2 guns. Let's go. There was nothing Danny could do about it, so he went. The jail was in the basement of the city hall, which sat in the center of the town square. It consisted of 3 cells, all empty at the moment. Danny was given the middle one. Listen, he said to Chief Herbert through the bars. If you're going to be a boob about this, at least you can check my story. Paul Wilson and Mrs. Larson were in my room when the mayor phoned, and could hear what he said because his voice carried. You might also try to find out what was missing from the dressing room. There must be a cleaning woman or something familiar with the place. Sure, the fat man said. We'll put our homicide and arson squad on it, Danny said a 4-letter word. Following a night of fitful tossing on the hard, drop-down bunk, he was awake by 7 when Chief Herbert appeared accompanied by a uniformed policeman carrying Danny's suitcase. When the policeman had set the suitcase inside the cell and relocked the door, the chief sent him off to get some breakfast for the prisoner. The fat man examined Danny's reddened eyes through the bars. No sleep, huh? He asked. No, Danny said shortly. Took the liberty of removing your gun from the bag, the chief said. Also checked with Buffalo by phone. It's yours all right, and they got no record of you owning another. But your prints are on the murder gun and Angus's on the cane. The little man began removing shaving equipment from the suitcase. They could have been put there after Angus was dead and I was unconscious. Maybe, the chief said noncommittally. Also checked your story with Wilson and Mrs. Larson. They both say far as they're concerned, you can rot in jail. Danny looked up quickly. You mean they refused to verify my phone call from Angus? Not refused, exactly. Said they didn't know. Both remembered you got a phone call, but all they heard was your side of the conversation and you didn't call the other party by name. That's kind of interesting, the little man said slowly. Angus's voice carried, because Mrs. Larson remarked it sounded like him. And if she could recognize the voice, maybe she could hear everything he said. Apparently the mayor was alone when he phoned, so Mrs. Larson and Wilson were the only ones aside from me knew he'd discovered something about the murder. They got in a car together, and could have made it to the theater 10 minutes before I got there. Danny turned the hot water spigot on the bowl in one corner of the cell, found it did not work and filled the bowl with cold water. Also talked to Maggie, the cleaning woman at the Bijou, the chief said. Had her check over everything in the dressing room. She knows the place by heart, and there ain't a thing missing. Danny stopped lathering his face and turned slowly. Then what the devil was Angus talking about? Thought maybe you might know, Herbert said. You're a big city cop, Danny said. What was in the dressing room when you checked it with Maggie? Not much. That's why she's so sure nothing is missing. It ain't exactly furnished in luxury. The chief brought a scrap of paper from his pocket. 3 dressing tables with mirrors and 3 chairs. 1 small stand with a phone and phone book on it. Wash stand in one corner. Dozen clothes hooks around the walls. On each dressing table is a box of face tissue, a makeup kit, jar of cold cream and a water tumbler. Think of anything else that ought to be in a dressing room? Not offhand, Danny said. You don't really think I killed Angus, do you? Don't know. But you're staying locked up till I find out. Danny finished his shave and was repacking his suitcase when breakfast arrived. It was restaurant fare, brought in from outside, and it was good, consisting of eggs, bacon, toast and coffee. At least you feed well, he said to Herbert, who still stood outside the cell. We can afford to. Don't have many prisoners. That's from the Missouri Cafe. As he ate, Danny kept turning over in his mind the list of items the chief had read off as being in the dressing room, and suddenly the item Mayor Angus might have meant occurred to him. Carefully he set down his coffee cup, looked up at the fat chief and said, You know, I just figured this whole thing out. Vi. Chief Herbert regarded his prisoner placidly and waited for him to go on. I got it figured out, Danny repeated, provided I can find out one thing. He frowned thoughtfully at his empty coffee cup, then glanced up at the chief. Stone's body is due on a train at noon. Think you could get an autopsy done right quick? Might. Why? We don't need a complete autopsy. Just want to know whether or not he'd been doped. Tell the doc to look for knockout drops first. Chloral hydrate. If he can't find that, tell him to test for the other hypnotics. Sodium amytal, for instance. Sodium what? Amytal. AMYTA1. Better write it down, the chief said. For the next 3 hours Danny lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling. At 11 o'clock, when Chief Herbert returned, he had just fallen asleep. He was awakened by the chief tossing spit balls through the bars at his head. Danny stretched and sat up. The doc found the stuff, Herbert announced. Chloral hydrate. Now tell me how you knew. Genius, the little man said modestly. Do I get out of here now? The chief shook his head. Finding stone full of knockout drops proves nothing about Angus's killing. You're still the only suspect I got, and I'm hanging on to you till I get a better one. He contemplated the prisoner and added consolingly. I'm a pretty cooperative guy though. You keep calling the bets and I'll fade them. Listen, Danny said. Let me out of here and I'll crack both cases. How you expect me to do anything from jail? Is a tough problem, Chief Herbert admitted. Good thing you're a genius so you can figure it out. The little man stared at his jailer coldly. All right, he said finally. Break them yourself. He lay back on his bunk again and deliberately rolled his face to the wall. Want to talk to you, Gumbo, said the chief. Turn over, Danny continued to ignore him. Don't you think it's time we stopped calling this dead kid Stone and started calling him Sal Gumbo? Slowly Danny rolled over and sat on the edge of the bunk. You're not as sleepy as you look, he said. The chief put his hands behind him and teetered back and forth. Thought it kind of funny Buffalo would send a cop 900 miles to check up on a dead guy. So when I phoned last night, I asked them. Found out you weren't sent here at all. You're on leave of absence. The kid was my brother, Danny said. Now you know why I was so sure he was framed. Listen, why don't you let me out of here? If I can't crack this case in 24 hours, I'll come back voluntarily. The fat chief shook his head. Not a chance. If I turned you loose when the whole town thinks you shot the mayor, I might as well resign. The gossip you spread backfired a little. Talk is Angus hired Larson killed, you found it out and killed Angus instead of just arresting him, as you ought. For a moment he examined the little man expressionlessly. Matter of fact, not only ain't I going to turn you loose, I'm aiming to stay up all night on guard, case you make a break. This jail ain't as strong as it might be. I won't make a break, Danny said irritably. Good. Be embarrassing to the town council if you broke out. I've been asking for repair money 2 years now. Keep telling them the jail's falling apart. Danny gazed at the fat man in astonishment. Was the chief subtly suggesting he would not be opposed if he broke jail, but could not be officially released? The thought was fantastic, but what other interpretation could be put on the man's remarkable comment that the jail was falling apart? Again Danny got the impression that Chief Herbert was on his side, but for some reason must keep up a public front of unrelenting opposition. He waited until the middle of the afternoon to test the chief's description of the jail. Then he rose from his bunk and wandered to the single window, which contained 3 vertical bars set in mortar. Since the jail was in the basement, the window was scarcely a foot above ground level. None of the loiterers on the town square seemed to be looking his way. Tentatively Danny reached out and grasped the center bar. He shook it slightly and a minute shower of crumbling mortar fell from the upper hole in which the bar was embedded. Satisfied, he returned to his bunk and took a nap until supper time. After supper he sat doing nothing until the chief came back at 9, announced. Lights out, and threw a switch in the hall. Danny waited 15 minutes, then went to work on the bar. The only tool he had was his straight razor, which against every principle of penal custody the chief had left in his possession. He ruined the razor, but the mortar holding the bar in place was so dried out and crumbly, it took him only 10 minutes to gouge out enough to remove the bar. Noiselessly setting it on the floor, he grasped the other 2 bars in either hand, braced his feet against the wall and literally walked up it. He squeezed between the 2 outer bars feet first, going through easily up to his chest, then turning sidewise to get his shoulders through. There was no moon, and the old-fashioned shaded street lamps at each corner of the square cast a bright circle of light directly beneath themselves, but left the rest of the square in pitch darkness. The Missouri Café, directly across from Danny's cell, was the only business establishment still open, apparently, and the diffused light from its show window made for bare visibility on the City Hall lawn. Just as Danny rose to his feet, he made out a portly shadow at one corner of the building. The shadow moved, and a highlight glinted on metal. Who's there? Chief Herbert's voice demanded. Danny froze against the side of the building. For a long period neither moved, though momentarily Danny expected the chief either to speak again or walk toward him. He was puzzled rather than chagrined by the chief's challenge, for he could not reconcile it with the fat man's seeming suggestion to break jail. And being puzzled, Danny decided to wait to see what would happen. What had happened outraged him. Metal again glinted in the chief's hand, then his heavy revolver roared. Dirt rained into Danny's face as the bullet slammed the ground almost between his feet. For an incredulous instant Danny remained frozen, then rage at his own gullibility flowed over him as the thought flashed into his mind that Chief Herbert had deliberately talked him into breaking jail for the purpose of killing him while attempting escape. Spinning, he headed for the opposite corner of the city hall at a dead run. Another shot crashed, the bullet almost nicking one heel, then he was around the corner and scooting diagonally across the wide lawn. Apparently the chief reached the corner of the building just as Danny reached the other side of the street, for a third bullet wonged into the curbstone and careened upward with a dull whine. Then Danny was plunging between two shops into pitch darkness. From the roof of the city hall a siren began to scream. For 2 blocks Danny ran down an alley, then entered a backyard and cut back a half block by climbing fences. This brought him into the parking area behind the building housing the bingo hall and bookshop run by Harry Stewart. Danny stopped between 2 cars parked in the lot to organize his plan of action. He was still both angry and amazed by Chief Herbert's performance, for he believed the man had deliberately maneuvered him into position so that he could be killed safely and legally, which caused Danny to reconsider the entire situation. The most logical assumption to follow was that Chief Herbert wanted him dead because Danny was too close to the real answer to the 3 killings. And the most logical assumption to follow the original assumption the hood and finally to the car's turret top. From it he was able to reach the first landing of the fire escape without pulling down the iron ladder and risking its creak. Swinging himself up, he noiselessly climbed to the 2nd floor. The window giving out on the fire escape led into Harry Stewart's office, and it was locked. Danny wrapped his handkerchief tightly around his fist, struck the upper pane sharply just above the catch and was rewarded by a mild crash of splintered glass. Without pausing to determine if the noise had been heard. It was either that Chief Herbert was the killer, or a part of the underworld organization he claimed did not exist in St. Michael. Glaring headlights flashed at the entrance of the alley, and Danny dropped between the 2 cars. A patrol car, probably the town's sole one, went by slowly, playing a spotlight over the yards on the other side of the alley, against the rear of the fire hall on this side and into the parking lot. Momentarily it hovered on a fire escape at the rear of the bingo building. As soon as the squad car passed, Danny rose and moved to a car parked directly under the fire escape. Through the rear of the frame building he could hear the drone of a bingo caller's voice announcing numbers. Stepping on the car's bumper, Danny climbed to the left front fender, then to below. He reached through to release the catch, raised the lower pane and crawled through. Quickly he drew the shade behind him, and in pitch blackness felt along the wall for the light switch. He found it near the door. The room contained very little furniture. Centered against one wall was a scarred desk upon which sat a telephone. The only other furnishings were a filing cabinet, a safe and 2 straight-back chairs. Danny tackled the 3 drawers of the filing cabinet first. The top drawer contained file folders which in turn seemed to contain general correspondence. The second held a large ledger which a cursory examination disclosed to be a record of business disbursements. Apparently the record of profits, if any, was kept in the safe. Quickly Danny thumbed through it, noting there were 4 separate categories of disbursements listed, the 4 being given no designations other than A, B, C and D. A random check of some of the expenses listed showed under A such items as folding chairs, 10,000 markers, 500 number cards and piano repair, under B such things as turf news and telephone service, under C almost entirely B purchases of liquors and beer and under greater than 3 dozen dex cards, 5 dozen dice and 500 chips. All 4 categories contained a number of disbursements to persons listed by name, most of them appearing at regular intervals for the sale amount each time. These Danny guessed to be salaries. Rapidly he glanced over the names listed, hoping to find that of Mayor Angus or Chief Ward Herbert, but none were names he had ever seen before. He closed the ledger and went on to the bottom drawer. The lower drawer disclosed a half carton of cigarettes, 2 bottles of bourbon and a small wooden rack with several round slots in it which held 3 shot cups and 3 highball glasses. Danny uncorked and sniffed at each bottle of whiskey. Then he poured a drop from each into his palm and tasted it. He frowned, replaced both bottles, lifted out the glass rack and peered into each glass. All seemed to be clean. Abandoning the filing cabinet, he went to work on the desk. He found what he was looking for at the rear of the second drawer he examined. The small box bore no label, but it contained 5 papers of crystalline powder. Shoving the box into his pocket, Danny crossed the room and was just reaching for the light switch when the door suddenly opened. "I thought I heard breaking glass up here," Harry Stewart said in a conversational tone over the .45 automatic in his hand. "I'll have to learn to be more quiet," Danny said politely. 7. Harry Stewart moved into the room and circled toward the desk without allowing his gun muzzle to waver from its bead on Danny's nose. Jack, the red-haired cashier, followed the yellow-faced man through the door. "Have a chair," invited Stewart, indicating one of the straight backs with his gun. Obediently the little man seated himself. His eyes still on Danny, Stewart reached down with his left hand and drew all the way open the drawer in which Danny had found the box of powders. Momentarily he dropped his eyes to it, immediately raised them again and pushed the drawer shut. He smiled slightly. "Heard they had an autopsy on that bandit," he said. Danny said. "You must have an in with the police." The bookmaker raised one eyebrow. "A councilman can find out most everything, if he goes to the bother." His pleasant expression faded and his voice became ominous. "Hand it over." "What?" Danny asked, then decided pretended ignorance would only delay the inevitable, and started to reach for his pocket. "The box, Stewart," Harry said. The little man's movement toward his pocket stopped and his face flushed at the nickname. "Come and get it, you yellow-faced ape." The red-headed Jack casually stepped behind Danny's chair. The little man's head turned to follow him warily, then snapped back toward Stewart when the bookmaker rasped. "Eyes front, or I'll blow your head off." At the sale moment a gun barrel crashed down on Danny's head. A surging, then diminishing roar, such as the breaking of surf against a cliff, awakened Danny. For nearly a minute he lay in throbbing pain, dully trying to figure out how the ocean could have moved itself to southern Missouri. Then he realized the noise was all within his head. He waited with closed eyes until the pain subsided to a persistent ache, then opened them to equal darkness. He lay on the rear floor of a speeding sedan, he discovered, and his hands were bound behind him so tightly they were numb to the shoulders. His legs were tied together both at the ankles and knees, but not so tightly that circulation was stopped. His forehead pressed against someone's foot, and the person's other foot casually rested on his shoulder. "This is about far enough," said the owner of the feet. Danny recognized the voice as that of the yellow-faced bookmaker. Obediently the car came to a halt. The front door on the driver's side opened, then slammed shut again. At the sale time Harry Stewart pushed open the rear door on the other side. For a moment his full weight rested on Danny's shoulder as he stepped from the car, and the little man had to clench his teeth to prevent a groan of pain. A moment later he was unceremoniously dragged from the car and dumped on the ground. Giving no indication of consciousness, Danny allowed his eyes barely to slit open. A half-moon had now risen, and by its subdued light the bound man made out that they were parked on a graveled road running parallel to a railroad track. In the distance he heard the slow whistle of a freight. Between the tracks and the road was a shallow ditch choked with weeds and small bushes, some of the bushes being nearly shoulder high. "All right, snap it up," Harry Stewart ordered his companion roughly. He stooped to grasp Danny's shoulders as the driver caught him beneath the knees. Like a sack of grain the two carried the little man into the ditch, dropping him between two bushes. The freight's whistle sounded again, clearer this time, but still a mile or two away. Harry Stewart kneeled over the bound man, unexpectedly flashing a light into his eyes. Instead of snapping shut his barely opened lids, Danny rolled his eyeballs upward so that only the whites showed. A palm slapped him solidly across the mouth. He let his head roll loosely with the slap, which faced it away from the light and allowed him unnoticeably to close his eyes. Fingers groped for his throat, pinched together a bit of the tender flesh beneath his chin and squeezed until tears of pain gathered beneath the little man's closed lids. But he managed to keep his face vacant of expression and his body limp. Still out like a swatted fly, Harry Stewart decided, rising to his feet. "Get to work on his legs and I'll take his hands." "Wouldn't it be safer to leave him tied?" the dubious voice of Cashier Jack inquired. "How the devil would you explain it as an accident with ropes around him?" Stewart asked. "Snap it up. If we miss this freight, we got a 2-hour wait till the next." Danny felt hands fumbling at his bonds, and a minute later he was free. But he might as well have remained bound insofar as use of his arms was concerned, for the tight cords had stopped circulation and both arms were asleep. Attempting to flex his muscles, the little man discovered neither arm would respond to his will. Although his legs tingled. Danny learned both were in working order by wriggling his toes within his shoes. The train whistle blew a third time, seeming only hundreds of yards away, and now the roar of wheels and the rumbling rattle of freight cars could be heard. Then the track in front of them was suddenly bathed with light. Above the growing noise, Harry Stewart shouted to his companion. "Keep down till the engine is past, so they don't see us in the headlight." With a hiss of escaping steam, the locomotive swished past, dragging behind it a long row of box cars which seemed as though it would never end. "Now!" the bookmaker yelled, slipping his hands under Danny's shoulders and pulling him half erect. Danny felt his arms flop limply, tried to propel some power into them by force of will, then gave up the struggle as hopeless. His feet were grasped by the red-headed Jack and he was lifted bodily. "Let him fly on 3, Stewart yelled above the train roar. "And time it right, so he goes clear under." Together they swung his limp body forward slightly. 1. Stewart counted. They swung Danny back, and as he reached the peak of the back swing, the bookmaker said, 2. At the sale instant, Danny jerked both knees to his chest, pulling the redhead off balance, snapped his legs straight again and felt Jack release them as though propelled from a catapult. There was one wild scream which cut off suddenly at a sickening crunch. Beside thrusting Jack beneath the train, Danny's kick expended part of its force in the opposite direction, causing Harry Stewart to stagger back and sit down with a crash. Immediately he sprang to his feet again and threw himself at Danny. With his arms flopping uselessly at his sides, Danny rolled to his back, again brought both feet to his chest and kicked the larger man solidly in the stomach. Stewart staggered backward, teetered on 1 foot inches from the speeding box cars, and for a horrified moment gyroscoped his arms in an attempt to keep from falling beneath the wheels. He fell to one elbow, at the last instant twisting from beneath the wheels, and started to scramble to safety on hands and knees. But his moment of terrified balancing had allowed Danny to leap to his feet. Aiming deliberately, the little man swung his right leg back and kicked the scrambling bookmaker solidly on the jaw. It took Danny 10 minutes to restore circulation to his dead arms, and another 10 to tie his unconscious opponent and drag him to the car. The box of pills he found in Stewart's coat pocket, and the automatic in a holster under his arm. He relieved the man of both. Half lifting and half heaving, he managed to get the big man on the car's rear floor. Then he turned the car and drove back to town, the bookmaker tied and unconscious in the back seat. They had been nearly 10 miles out, Danny discovered, and the city hall clock struck midnight as he parked on the town square. The only lights in the city hall were in the basement, on the side containing the jail and police headquarters. Over the basement entrance to police headquarters a small green light was burning. Danny moved to a lighted window and peered into the main office. A single uniformed policeman slept in a chair with his feet elevated to a desk. Beyond him, down a hall, the little man could see the open door of the chief's office, and a light burned within it. Without sound the little man tiptoed under the green light, past the sleeping policeman and down the hall. Next to the open door of the chief's office he paused, drew the automatic he had taken from Harry Stewart and ruefully felt the twin bumps on his head. Then he took a deep breath and entered the office. Chief Ward Herbert looked up calmly from the fiction magazine he had been reading. "Howdy," he said. "Been waiting up for you." The little man circled to a chair against one wall, seated himself, thrust the automatic in his coat pocket, but kept it aimed at the chief through the cloth. "As I remember," he said tightly. "You told me your town council consisted of 7 members." The chief nodded, his face expressionless. "One of them, Harry Stewart, is tied up in the back seat of a car outside. Get on the phone and call a special meeting of the rest of them for right now. We'll hold it here." "Why?" the fat man asked. 2 reasons, Danny told him. "The first is that I don't trust the police chief and want to break this case to the council. The second is that if you don't start calling, I'll blow you apart." The fat chief allowed his eyebrows to raise. Then he shrugged, picked up the phone and after a moment said, "Hello, operator. Which one is this?" After a pause he said, "Oh, Jane. Listen Jane, you know who the council members are, don't you? I want a special meeting of them in my office right now, yeah, fast as they can get here, never mind Harry Stewart. He's already here." He cradled the phone, looked up at Danny and asked, "Satisfied?" "Not quite," the little man said. "Now get hold of the 3 witnesses to the Missouri Cafe robbery and get them over here." The chief looked at him in surprise. "The Missouri's been closed over an hour," he objected. "And I don't think either waitress or Henry, the cook, have phones." "Send the cop sleeping in the front office," Danny said. Then added in a warning tone. "One attempt to signal him you're covered, and you'll get a bullet in the stomach. That's a target I could hardly miss." Without taking his eyes from Danny, the chief raised his voice and bellowed. "Johnson. There was the sound of feet hitting the floor with a bang, and a moment later the uniformed cop came running into the room. He halted when he saw Danny, and his eyes widened. But he could not see the gun which was hidden from him. Sergeant Gumbo came back of his own free will, the chief explained mildly. Everything's under control. Run over to Sadie's rooming house and bring back Janet and Mona, the two waitresses from the Missouri Cafe. Don't know their last names. Then pick up Henry, the cook. He sleeps back of the restaurant, I think. Johnson repeated the instructions, nodded his head twice and left the room. For nearly a minute after his departure, Danny and Chief Herbert silently examined each other. Finally the chief spoke. Mind explaining the reason for the gun while we wait? Not at all. I don't know how you fit in this, but you fit somewhere, or you wouldn't have needled me into a jailbreak so you could kill me and still be able to explain it. The fat man nodded his head slowly. Thought that might be what was eating you. Thought I tried to kill you, huh? What's your story? The little man asked coldly. Leaning back in his swivel chair, the chief clasped hands across his stomach. Got tired of waiting for you to move. Decided to light a fire under you. He paused, then added. Also wanted to show the general public their chief of police was on the ball, even though the town council is too stingy to give us a decent jail. Be a nice story if you hadn't missed so close, Danny said, his tone still cold. The chief's voice took on a faintly injured tone. I guess you didn't know, he said, that I'm the state champ pistol shot. 8. For nearly another minute the little man did not say anything. Eventually he said. That makes the story a little better. I might even believe it if you can explain why you've been sitting on the fence in this investigation and letting me do all the work. Figured you were a smart feller and could work it out alone. The chief's eyes half closed, and he asked. You ever live in a small town? No, Danny admitted. If you had, you'd realize a chief of police can't push prominent citizens around on mere suspicion. Look at the suspects you picked. One by one he ticked them off on his fingers. The mayor, 3 members of the town council and the widow of the late chairman of the citizens committee. Even if one was guilty, the other 4 would hate my guts before I got through. I knew something was phony about that stick-up, but what could I do? The little man frowned at him. Suppose I hadn't dropped around? Were you just going to let somebody get away with murder? But you dropped around, the chief said, undisturbed. It was a large gathering to be crowded into the small room Chief Herbert called his office. On folding chairs facing the chief's desk in a semicircle sat Paul Wilson, Art Simon and the 4 other councilmen. Harry Stewart, handcuffed and with his jaw twice its normal size, sat in one corner under the watchful eye of the policeman Johnson. The 2 waitresses, Janet and Mona, and the cook, Henry, sat along the opposite wall. Behind the desk the chief comfortably hunched, while Danny sat to the right of the desk, facing the audience. Chief Herbert said to the councilman. Sorry to call you out so late, but Sergeant Gumbo here claims he's got the Missouri Cafe robbery and the mayor's murder all solved. He don't quite trust the police department, so wants to present his evidence to the council. He turned to Danny. You're running the performance, Gumbo. I'll cut in if I have anything to say. The little man ran his eyes about the circle, but aside from the open-mouthed awe of Janet and Mona, he detected no emotion stronger than rapt attention. To start off I better explain that the hobo you knew as Sal Stone was actually a professional magazine article writer named Sal Gumbo. He was my kid brother. He paused long enough to stare broodingly around the circle again. Larson's murderer had a nice plan to knock Larson off and put the blame on a hobo nobody would bother to check up on. Probably would have worked if he'd picked a real hobo, but he had the bad luck to ick a hobo in disguise who had a cop rotor. Reaching in his pocket, Danny drew out the box of powders. This I found in Harry Stewart's desk drawer. This morning an autopsy was performed on my brother and he was found full of chloral hydrate. In commoner language, he'd been slipped a Mickey Finn. I think an analysis of the contents of this box will show it matches the dope in my brother's stomach. He tossed the box to the chief. Better mark it as evidence. The next bit of evidence is not so definite, Danny went on. It's more a matter of reasoning. Just before he was killed, Mayor Angus phoned me that he had discovered something missing from the men's dressing room at the Bijou, and the missing item put an entirely different construction on the Larson killing. A check of the room by a cleaning woman who knew every item in it disclosed that absolutely nothing was gone. Our first assumption was that the cleaning woman had forgotten some item, but a better explanation was that when she checked, the item had been returned. As a matter of fact, the murderer was in the act of returning it when he overheard Mayor Angus's phone conversation, realized he had figured out how Larson's murder was accomplished, and killed the mayor to shut him up. There were so few items in the dressing room, By checking the list of contents, you can almost immediately guess which item had been stolen and later returned. From memory, Danny announced the items the chief had read from his list. Obviously, what Angus found missing was one of the makeup kits, he concluded. What happened was this: the murderer kidnapped Sal. I'll explain how in a minute. Put on Sal's clothes, used the makeup kit he swiped from the theater to give himself a putty broken nose and a scar through one eyebrow, covered the lower part of his face with a handkerchief and stuck up the restaurant. After killing Larson, he put the clothes back on Sal's unconscious body, stuck the gun and money in his pocket, took him a mile out of town and threw him feet first under a freight train. Gumbo paused for a moment before continuing his explanation. Everything went as the murderer planned until two things happened, he said. First, the rumor got around that some local person had hired the hobo to kill Larson, and then the mayor discovered the makeup kit missing and did a bit of brilliant deduction. Unfortunately for Mayor Angus, he did his deducting while the murderer was listening, and got himself killed for his trouble. Just to round things out neatly, the person who killed Angus decided to frame me for it, thereby knocking off two birds with one stone. If you've all followed me so far, you'll realize the murderer has to be someone about Sal's build. Briefly, Danny's eyes flicked over Paul Wilson, Art Jacobs, and Harry Stewart. Of the four main suspects, that lets out only Mrs. Larson as the murderer, and is the reason she wasn't required to be here tonight. No one said anything, and Danny went on softly. Some of you people got pretty mad when I started gossip circulating all over town, and that's what gave me my first real lead. 5 people were being publicly slandered, but only 3 called to see me. An innocent person's reaction when accused of a crime is to yell his head off, which is exactly what Mayor Angus, Mrs. Larson and Wilson did. The only 2 who failed to show up were Harry Stewart and Art Simon. Harry Stewart licked his lips and remained silent. If that's an accusation, Simon broke in, you better be able to prove it. In 10-2, Danny informed him agreeably. I've already tied Harry Stewart into this, because he tried to kill me tonight. You worked it in conjunction with Harry, but you did the actual killing of Gumbo, and probably of Angus. Stewart's job was to dispose of the hobo bandit. I looked over a disbursement ledger in Stewart's office earlier tonight and found something interesting. 4 categories of business disbursements are included in the sale book. None are designated, but a study of the expenditures indicates the 4 businesses involved are a bingo game, a bookshop, a tavern and a casino. They wouldn't all be in the sale account book unless they were all under the sale control. You and Harry Stewart are secretly partners. Under his clipped mustache, the bearded man's lips curled ironically. Is partnership a crime? Partnership in murder, Danny assured him. You're finished, Simon. I even know how you managed to kidnap Sal in broad daylight. The little man's eyes were cold as he went on. Probably you'd had details of the plan worked out for some time and were just waiting for a hobo or tramp of the right size to come along. Nearly every visitor to town gets to the Blue Goose eventually, so you didn't even have to go looking. And the plan was beautifully simple. You merely gave the guy you thought was a hobo $1 to deliver a note for you to Harry Stewart at the bookshop. The note was Harry's signal to offer the hobo a drink in the privacy of his office, and the drink was full of knockout drops. It's not true. The yellow-faced bookmaker in the corner said desperately. Don't be dragging me into this. Shut up. Art Simon snapped at him. His face was pale, but his smile remained ironic. You're a wonderful storyteller, Gumbo, but so far you haven't mentioned a shred of evidence aside from that box, whose contents haven't even been analyzed yet. I will, Danny reassured him. That's why the robbery witnesses are here. He turned toward the cook and 2 waitresses. I want you 3 to think back to the robbery. Did all of you notice the gun closely? Janet said. Notice it. I hardly took my eyes off it. Yeah, Mona put in. It was a black automatic. A great big. Now I want you to concentrate, Danny interrupted. If your attention was fixed on the gun, you must have noticed the hand holding it too. Remember anything peculiar about that hand? All 3 looked blank. Then Henry the cook's eyes strayed toward Art Simon's right hand. Understanding blossomed on his face, and he said quickly. If you mean Mr. Simon's diamond ring, the bandit wasn't wearing it. For an instant Danny felt his whole case crumbling about him, but then Janet spoke. He wasn't wearing a ring, she said slowly. But I remember now there was a white circle on his trigger finger. Why sure, Mona chimed in immediately. I remember that too, Henry snapped his fingers. Of course. Gee, I'm dumb. I can even remember wondering what caused it, in spite of being so scared. It was the mark where a ring had been worn. There you are, gentlemen, Danny said. All tied. Then he grabbed at the automatic in his side pocket and drew himself sidewise as the glittering stone on the bearded man's forefinger formed a gleaming arc toward his armpit. Danny's gun became entangled in the cloth, and as he hit the floor an enormous explosion mushroomed in the small room. The little man's body involuntarily flinched, but he rolled free. On hands and knees he looked up to see Art Simon slowly lean backward, an automatic dangling limply from one hand, then topple to the floor like a falling timber. Danny thrust his gaze upward toward the chief in time to see a final wisp of smoke curl from his big revolver. The handcuffed Harry Stewart crouched half out of his chair, as though wondering which way to run. "You," Chief Herbert said to him affably, "had better sit down and relax." The end.